Oh, hey there, sorry. I was just listening to some classical music. What's going on, guys? It's your boy Didier and welcome to Music HQ. Today we're going to be answering the question, is classical music boring? Let's get right into it.
Music HQ.
Let's face it, many people find classical music boring, young people in particular. One study suggests that of all the classical music concert goers in the UK, only 7% are likely to be under the age of 31. That really says something about how young people view classical music. I hear a lot of my friends talk about classical music as if it's outdated, music for an older generation, or simply music to relax to or sleep to. So it really seems like classical music is not the thing that young people want to be spending their time doing. In fact, how many times have you heard your friends saying they're weighing up whether to go to a London Philharmonic performance or to go and see Drake? Seeing as we're talking about classical music, what exactly is it? So here's what the Cambridge Dictionary says about classical music. Classical music is music that is considered to be part of a long, formal tradition and to have lasting value. And now I'm sure you probably agree with me that that's a really unhelpful definition, which doesn't help us at all in clarifying exactly what classical music is. But what it does tell us is that it's hard to define. Nevertheless, there are some distinguishing factors which help us identify if a piece is classical or not. The first one of these is where it's being performed. Classical music is often performed in large auditoriums such as the Royal Albert Hall in London, the Concertgebouw in Amsterdam, or Carnegie Hall in New York. Another distinguishing factor is the instrumentation. Classical music is often associated with particular instruments such as the violin, the harp, the flute, and the oboe. However, one of the key things which separates classical music from some of the other fine genres of music in the world is that it has often been written by composers who are now dead, it's often performed by performers who are still alive, and it's played to an audience who are right on the edge. So basically, it is hard to define exactly what classical music is. Nevertheless, there are ways to identify a piece of classical music. So, is classical music boring? Well, obviously, if people find it boring, then it is. So here's the real question. Why do some people find classical music boring? We can look at two areas when trying to answer this question. The first is non-musical reasons, and the second, you guessed it, musical reasons. So let's start with the non-musical reasons. Exposure. Exposure plays a massive part in musical taste. That means if you were exposed to classical music at a young age, you're much more likely to enjoy it. Now, there are different ways in which you might have been exposed to it, and there are different reasons for these. One reason is culture. For example, if you were brought up in the UK, you're much more likely to have been exposed to it than if you were brought up in a country which did not have such a strong tradition of classical music. Another reason which ties into culture is location. If you were brought up in a rural area, you're much less likely to have been exposed to it than if you were brought up in a city which has many classical music concert venues and where the music thrives. Another factor is socio-economic. Unfortunately, classical music is still quite expensive to play. You have to pay for lessons and pay for instruments, some of which can cost thousands of pounds. So if you come from a low-income family, it's a lot more difficult for you to be exposed to classical music and to get involved in classical music education or go to classical music performances. Finally, family background definitely affects your exposure to classical music. If your parents were listening to it in the house when you were young, then you'd have been exposed quite a lot more to it than someone whose parents didn't listen to it. Let's move on to the musical reasons. Musical reason number one, the pieces are long, as in really long. Some classical music pieces can clock in at an hour to an hour and a half. In fact, one work of classical music, Wagner's Ring Cycle, times in at 17 hours. On the other hand, the average pop song times in at 3 minutes and 30 seconds. That's a massive difference, and a massive difference in how much you actually have to concentrate for the music. In this day and age, people's concentration spans are decreasing. We find it more difficult to read books, more difficult to read newspapers and longer articles, and we want everything to be instantaneous. So perhaps that suggests why young people don't seem to enjoy classical music as much. Another musical factor is the lack of repetition. The average pop song will have 2 or 3 melodies, the verse, the pre-chorus and the chorus, which each will be heard at least 2 or 3 times during the song. That means by the end of a pop song, you're very familiar with the melodic material. However, in classical music, this is not always the case. Although there is a lot of repetition in some classical pieces, these repetitions are usually further apart in time because the pieces are so long. The repetitions are often also adapted from the original, which means that even though they might be similar to the original, they will have variances which make it a little harder to recognize sometimes, and sometimes it's completely unrecognizable. And just to add to all of this, there is a lot of music in classical pieces which is not repeated. So you might hear a melody once and never hear it again. This again adds to the sense of unfamiliarity. A third musical issue is one of complexity. Now when I say complexity, I don't mean to say that classical music is more complex than other styles of music. However, I do mean that the kind of complexity that we hear in classical music makes it a lot more difficult to listen to than some other styles of music in many cases. I'm talking mostly about harmonic complexity. Most popular music is actually based on 3 or 4 chords. These chords are usually what we'd call diatonic. Diatonic basically means that you're playing all the right notes within the key that you're playing in. However, in classical music, composers often use non-diatonic chords. This means the chords don't necessarily fit in the key of the whole piece. These non-diatonic chords sound a bit more risky. Often, the non-diatonic chords are the ones which stand out the most. And as with anything that's risky, it can go one of 2 ways. It can either sound amazing, or it can sound a bit unfamiliar, and you wish they hadn't had written it like that. This is of course a massive oversimplification of what diatonicism means, but I still thought it would be really helpful to bring it up. Something else which ties into harmonic complexity is key changes. Key changes don't tend to happen as much in popular music. However, there are a few classic examples like Beyonce's Love on Top. Those key changes at the end just sound amazing. Now in classical music, key changes happen a lot more frequently. And again, this might be slightly unfamiliar to people who are used to listening to a lot of popular music. Perhaps another reason why people might find classical music a bit harder to listen to than some other styles. The final musical factor is groove. Now you know what I mean when I say groove. Groove is the thing in music which makes you want to dance. Groove is to do with rhythm, and it's basically when you repeat a consistent rhythmic pattern. However, classical music often doesn't have a sense of groove. The way time and tempo is approached in classical music is different. It's more about giving and taking of time. That means slowing down and speeding up, and we call this rubato. Whilst in popular music, you usually have a drum or a guitar, which gives you that strong sense of groove. In classical music, that's not often the case. Classical music tends to lean more to the sides of fluency and freedom, as opposed to consistency and repetition. Again, this is a huge generalization, but these are some of the qualities which classical music has that perhaps other styles of music don't have as much. So the fact that classical music often doesn't have a strong sense of groove can make it a bit harder to engage with in this day and age, considering that we're so used to hearing music which really does have a strong sense of groove. The first issue we spoke about was exposure to classical music. So if you want to go from finding it boring to finding it enjoyable, why not start by exposing yourself to it? Try listening to some classical music. Although we can't change the musical factors that might make the music sound boring, we can change how much we actually enjoy it. So I've created some custom playlists for you guys to listen to. You can choose 1 or 2 pieces from that playlist, and why not just listen to them a couple of times a week and see if you actually end up enjoying the pieces more the more you listen to them. Let us know what pieces you listen to in the comments below, and tell us how much you enjoyed it and whether listening to it more helps you to enjoy it more. I've put the links to the playlist in the description below as well. Have a browse of those and pick a piece or 2 that you want to listen to. I hope you found this video helpful, I hope you enjoyed it, and I hope to see you next time on Music HQ.